Steve. Thank you to our three speakers. We're running a little bit behind, but we still have just under 40 minutes for discussion. I want to throw the debate open to the floor. Can I ask you to identify yourself? And I presume we have a microphone. And if we could limit our comments and questions to be as short as possible, and I'll take 3 or 4 in a group. So.
My name's David Roberts.
Can you wait for the microphone, please?
Hello, my name is David Roberts. I'm currently a consultant and formerly a Commission civil servant, and I used to be responsible for trade issues in the Commission on Agricultural Trade. One of the things that I thought was missing in the presentation today was any reflection on the impact of current and projected world trade rules on future price shocks. You said be brief, and I will, but if you look quickly at what the current draft modalities for the Doha round would do if they were implemented, as perhaps they might be, there would be big reductions in import tariffs in the developed countries, no significant change in tariffs to overhaul applied tariffs in developing countries. There would be a big reduction in the capacity of developed countries to provide production stimulating support, and there would be an elimination of export subsidies by developed countries. All of which would mean, one would expect, that there would be a diversion of whatever level of world food production there is towards developed countries, because they can keep less out and produce less through policy stimulus. The other thing which is not in the room is a point made by Japan at the beginning of the Doha round, which is that current world trade rules have an imbalance in them, in that you have a commitment not to increase your import barriers, but only very weak restrictions on export restrictions, which was one of the issues picked up in this presentation. That virtually would not change. There are some new words, but they mean very much the same as what is currently in the Agreement on Agriculture. Now, the gamble in this is that by forcing up world prices, which is what one would expect all this to do, you will stimulate interest in production in food in the developing countries, and that's going to make everyone richer. If it's wrong, of course, it will mean that people who are presently extremely poor will be even poorer. I'm not aware of any empirical work which answers that question. Will we actually increase wealth overall in the developing countries and therefore produce a beneficial spiral of more production, more wealth, and better welfare? Or have the developing countries been led by the nose by Brazil, who, as the leading developing country,
to cut you off, I'm afraid.
Has led them all to support this thesis? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Duncan Green, Oxfam. Thanks very much for the presentations. We've just finished a piece of work on the impact of the financial crisis, and the similarity is uncanny. So resilience, how long can the resilience last before it's replenished? How important is government action to replenishing government resilience, people's resilience, and not finding many of the impacts we expected in terms of mass return to the villages, people putting their kids out of school, all that kind of thing. Quite extraordinary. I mean, really interesting sort of similarities. A couple of questions. One is, do you think the food price crisis is coming back? Because global prices have been going up since March last year, so this is very much not an academic exercise. What are the implications for us as we think about the second food price crisis, if it's coming? And the one other point, which is there's a very big impact of the food price crisis in other countries, but not in your case study countries, which is land grabs. So the actions by other countries in terms of buying up 10% of African arable land for production for their own food security issues is a clearly major impact in some countries, but just not your case studies.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, thanks. Liz Wilson from Imperial College. I just really wanted to know a little bit more about the future of this work. I found it fascinating, and I'd really like to see whether there might be scope for it to be done in more countries or more contexts. But Equally, you talked about the lack of M&E already, and I wondered how you see this might contribute to that going forward. Thanks.
Sheila.
Thank you, Sheila Page, ODI. I was slightly puzzled. 2 or 3 times different ones of you said, but this was only affecting 2% or only affecting 3% of the population. Surely any response to something like this is going to be a multiple network of responses, each of which may only affect 2 or 3%. So is this really a problem? And very specifically on Rachel's point about, is there a risk that we'll be looking too much at the immediately affected and less at the chronically poor? Again, is this really a risk? I mean, if you're actually looking at responses to crisis, you should be looking at changes. This doesn't mean that you stop all existing social protection for the chronically poor, but there could be a risk in not responding simply to the immediate problem. And I resist the temptation to say things about my neighbour.
Thanks, Sheila. Okay, let's turn to the panel now to take up those 4. Respond to those 4 points. I don't know who wants to respond to what. Do you want me to carve them out, or?
I can say a little bit about the
Carry on.
trade side of it. What do we see about trade rules and the ability of countries to respond here? 2 things are very, very clear. One is that thanks to rounds of liberalisation, one of the measures that most countries took, which was to cut their import tariffs in order to reduce the cost of imported food to consumers, they had very little room for manoeuvre. So Sierra Leone, for example, had a 15% tariff on imported rice. It cut the 15% tariff to 10%. Now, with the best will in the world, that's even if you'd cut the entire tariff. Bangladesh had a 5% tariff on imported rice, cut it to 0. But these are, you just don't have much scope for movement on that. Export bans. Well, export bans, of course, have got a very bad name in this particular case. Everybody I hear commenting on export bans says you can put any rule you like in WTO, but are you honestly going to stop an Indian commerce minister from stopping rice exports? Come on, it's not going to happen. Yeah, that's those
Okay.
are the 2
Who'd like to
big things.
talk on, is it coming back?
Is it coming back, the food price?
Yeah.
But, I just hear one of my contributors, more qualified to talk on this than me. I discussed it with him last night, George Rapsonamikis of the FAO Trade and Markets Division. And I mean, the thing he pointed to, he said, really, what's the fuel price? Because what will trigger an increase in food price is worldwide will be diversion of more food crops into ethanol. Until I don't think we're heading directly for a food price crisis at this moment, but that's always a distinct possibility.
Yeah. Rachel, do you want to comment on Sheila's point?
Yeah, I mean, when we've talked about coverage, we've been talking about coverage of specific social protection instruments. And I think one of the challenges that we have, and one of the reasons that I had that last slide that said, maybe what we do to try and address volatility in prices could be more socially protecting than what we're doing with safety nets, is because some of what we do, for example, subsidies, input subsidies, subsidies on sifted maize flour and so on, those kinds of things aren't necessarily targeted and can have much higher coverage. And I think what we need to know is how progressive or regressive some of those market actions are. And then we start to get an idea of how many people they're reaching and how many poor people they're reaching and how. And I think we're not clear on that, and we're particularly not clear on that compared to social assistance and transfers, just giving people cash or food or inputs. And I think in terms of new caseload, I have mixed feelings about this. I mean, if you look at the way that the Indonesian government over many years tried to deal with reducing fuel price subsidies, it brought the government down. Eventually, they managed to bring it in with a safety net program. But there's a very strong argument that if you're going to try and use social protection in response to a shock, then you shouldn't necessarily be just targeting the poorest people. And you actually may want to target well above the poverty line in order that you don't have riots and you don't have, and the government doesn't fall. And if you look at Iraq as an example, the attempt, they pushed out their food security subsidy after the Oil for Food programme to 99% of the population, because it was seen as a mechanism for stabilising and building some kind of public support. But I do think there's a big issue about whether, I think a lot of people have said, can we use the food price crisis as a way of getting more long-term social protection delivered in countries? And if you look at social protection over the last 5 or 10 years, there's been a big shift, particularly in Africa, but also in South Asia, away from ad hoc, year-on-year emergency responses where food and or cash usually arrive late, are not particularly effective, probably disrupt markets. We've tried to move away from that to much more predictable resourcing and programming. And my fear is that if we all get ready to leap into action when there's a shock, and only when there's a shock, to be honest, we're not doing it in any other year, then we're actually going to take our progress on social protection backwards. And that's the idea of this fear that, yes, we do need to respond to a shock, and we need to think about the stability of government and the impact that food riots have on it. But at the same time, I get very worried that we're going to respond to this shock, and then we're just going to step back and withdraw again. And stop supporting people, and in that way just obscure this much longer term chronic hunger problem that we have.
Thanks. And anything on the future of the work?
Oh, the future of this work.
With Diffid sitting behind you.
There would,
Is there a message for Diffid here?
is there a message for Diffid? I'm not sure what the message for Diffid is. We'll have a briefing paper on this inside of a month, and when we've written the briefing paper, we'll have a policy message or two in it. Yes.
Okay, I think we won't. I think Duncan's point we can take as an important one, but probably doesn't need a particular answer. Yeah. Right. Let me go around various. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Let's go around like that.
I'm Benny Dembitzer. I'm not affiliated to anything, thank God. But I wanted to ask again Duncan's point, and land tenure, which I know is a subject that young Steve doesn't like to address because he thinks that it's not key. But it seems to me that land tenure, particularly by the woman farmer, is essential for the future.
Jonathon Lingham from DFID's Food Group. Can I have the luxury of a quick comment on Jonathon Coulter's response on the energy costs, and also a very quick question for probably Steve, I think. One, yes, where are food prices going to go? Let's look at the future price of oil. Essential. Not so much that there's a clear link with biofuel production, which I've been studying now for the last 2.5 years. I'm still as confused as I was when I started. But simply because agriculture is a hugely energy-dependent industry. So if the price of oil goes up, yes, the cost of inputs is going to go up. That's got to be transferred to the finished product. My comment, that's my comment. My question for Steve is, I like very much your takeaway, your final point. Intervention's very good. People coped. We've been looking at short-term coping. One presumes also that, some of the interventions in the longer term from government, from NGOs, from donors, are also going to fall by the wayside, though we might try hard to make sure they don't. What does longer-term coping look like? We've seen short-term coping, and you've set those up very well, skipping meals, cutting down vegetables and fruit, other things. What does it mean in the long term?
Thank you. Ruchi Tripathi from Concern Worldwide UK. I think I picked up a couple of points in terms of learning lessons, and especially in terms of policy implications from here. I mean, I think what you were saying was what was in there in the countries, you can build upon that. So you can't start something new. and which sort of alludes to a longer-term agenda that Rachel's talking about. And I think yesterday I heard a lot more talk about trade policy in terms of the countries who are able to control their borders being a source, being probably the most positive interventions from those countries' perspective. And I didn't get the same sense here because it didn't cost the countries anything to have the border measures. And yes, I recognize a lot of countries can't do that. So I think not having an ideology behind it, but recognizing, as Steve, you said, certain countries will take those actions. So let's recognize it and try and make them more predictable, which was one of the messages we had yesterday, which was really useful for me. In terms of the production side, yes, I think lots of countries had subsidy, had packages. But again, let's try and use this opportunity of making them more environmental friendly, and also looking at the Uganda example of why the diet is so diverse. They don't spend 70 or 90% of their agriculture budget on maize, fertilizers, and seeds. So can we use this as an opportunity for those? And then finally on the coping, Jonathon, you were talking about sort of community grain banks, local level stuff. And I remember 15 years ago going to villages in Rajasthan and India and seeing some fantastic examples of community grain banks and community seed banks. They've disappeared over the years. And I think they haven't been invested. People haven't invested in them. And they had a diverse variety of seeds, which have disappeared. So I think it's probably not very sexy to invest in small projects. But again, if we're saying communities, coping is probably one of the most important findings from this study, and we need to invest in it. Let's try and do that again.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'd like to ask Francisco or Sarah if you have anything you want to say. About any of these comments. For example, land tenure might have particular issues in your cases.
I can get it. I will try. I will try to talk about the land tenure issue and about the short-term responses. Something that we found in Nicaragua very specifically is that sometimes we think about the short-term response on food security, on food production, but not necessarily is the same idea that the government has about what is the key factor for the crisis. In our case, our government was thinking about the full prices. Full is the gas, petroleum prices. And they were thinking about if they control these transport costs, they are going to have lower prices in food. That was the first reaction that they have. The second one was suspending tariff for imports. And even so, we have double quantity of import, prices didn't go down. And that is why we start to discuss about how the internal market, how the distribution of food in the internal market is working. And we found that there are 1 or 3 companies that they have all the distribution of rice, and that is a good issue. About the land tenure, what we saw even in Sierra Leone and, well, in the case of Nicaragua as well, is that the case of the rice, we depend 40%, 45% of total consumption on imports. The rice have a different curve if you compare that with beans and maize that we produce this kind of staple. So when we see that most of the price stabilization in this kind of staple was made by the local production for internal production, land tenure became a key issue. Mostly because we are going to have, in this moment, countries like Nicaragua have a GNI around 72.72. It's around 25% of farm has around 60 or 70% of the land. That's the distribution. And the tendency is that we are going to have more land concentration. And mostly the use of this land is going for cattle production. So there is a conflict about the land use between food production and cattle production. When I say food, it's bean and maize production.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve. Jonathan, you want to say something about community banks?
Yeah.
Banks?
Yes, the biggest experience with village grain banks is in West Africa, in Sahelian countries, and they've been promoted since the 1970 and have a record of progressive decapitalization. If one sees them as being a permanent addition to the landscape, one has to say that by and large they've failed. I understand from certain information they've done a bit better in areas where net deficit areas where production is low than areas where you have substantial. But what one really has to recognize is the tenacity that people go on promoting models which have not worked very well. I was in Burkina Faso last year on a World Bank project in which the people in the project wanted to initially promote grain banks, and people in the government did. But the World Bank study in the early 90s had really pointed to this failure. So, you know, this is a question of rolling out the money rather than projects wanting to identify things they can quickly put money into, and getting conceptual mix-up between, on the one hand, they're thinking of it in terms of, you know, they're trying to create, to promote as a sustainable, long-term sustainable institution. At the same time, they're very heavily thinking about distribution of charitable objectives, and you can't really put the two together very easily. So I would say I've been looking at projects which have been, the two areas where I see success is improving individual storage by farmers and others in rural areas. Cutting down on storage, technology has cut down on storage, let's improve storage. There's been some dramatic successes, notably in Nicaragua, in Proyecto Post Cosecha, and all of Central America, where they use small metal silos. And we see also the case of the Gates project. The Gates Foundation is promoting triple bagging of cowpeas, and that's very interesting technology. And of course, things are stored by individuals, they may look after them better than in a cooperative. Then, in terms of collective action, the most success I'm seeing is in a village inventory credit projects. But usually, where although the warehouse is controlled by a village organization, the goods are stored in the names of individuals. And of course, it's tied up with financial backing by a bank and microcredit, so you've got financial discipline in there. So strong incentive frameworks point towards sustainability. So what I'm saying is we need to work, particularly with organizations like your own, towards for sort of research and development over time to come out with really sustainable models you can popularize on a larger scale. Okay.
Thank you. Steve? On land?
Yeah, well, not on land. I mean, I'm not in disagreement with Benny about the advantage of secure land rights. Far from it. Let me just respond to Jonathan's challenge, which is, you know, what happens if we have to go on coping? What happens if prices go on rising? And my reaction to that is just to say two particular points. One is to come back to this point about changes in levels and volatility. And I guess the same point is also about, is not just timing, but it's the size of these jumps. I think there's an awful big difference between what happens to an economy and society if you see a food price double in 6 months versus what happens to a society if the price of the staple food goes up by, say, 20% over a couple of years and stays there. I think the chance for adjustment then in society is that much greater. Now look, the very early reports that we got from FAO was that nearly all the response to the food price spike, the increased cereals harvest that we saw in 2008, world's largest cereal harvest by a considerable margin, had come from OECD countries. The more we get close to the detail of that, the less robust is that particular claim. We've got this story from Bangladesh now, a 17%, it's a tremendous increase. Now, the minister who was telling us about this, he emphasised not the inputs, he emphasised the output price. I've just been looking at some data from Sri Lanka, talking to Sri Lankan farmers, where there's a thumping great fertiliser subsidy. What do the farmers say when they talk to them? Do you want fertiliser? Do you want this thumping great fertiliser subsidy? Well, yes, please, sir, but why can't we have a higher rice price? I think we're going to see, if prices do settle down to what people think they may be in the medium term, 20-30% higher for cereals prices than they were, say, in the year 2002. We do have cause for optimism that the price response will come through. And that price response, of course, will then knock on through society, through additional jobs and so on. So I think we have to be optimistic that we'll get those effects feeding through, that will counter-effect the negative effect of a higher base level for the staples prices.
Anyone else? Rachel, you want to say anything?
Not particularly, but I don't think anybody's really addressed Jonathan's question about longer-term coping.
I think about coping by migrating and issues like that.
Yeah.
That's going to have to be a whole new dynamic for the dairy as well.
I think one thing that we've not really said very much today that perhaps we should have done is a bit more on this distinction between net consumers and net producers, particularly in rural areas. And I think that links to some questions about what's happening to land tenure and people's ownership of land. But you know, we know that in Africa in particular and in parts of South Asia, most farmers are net consumers of food. They don't produce enough to meet their own needs, so they're always entering the market. And I wonder whether, in terms of longer term coping, whether we're going to see anything different from what we have and what we have had in terms of coping strategies for the last 10 or 20 or more years, because you know, variability isn't new, and volatility in production and in prices isn't new. And when we look at the list of different kinds of coping strategies we have, we might be learning a lot more about what's happening in urban areas, and that might be new. But I don't see much in terms of coping that's any different in a food price shock year than in any other year. It may be great, you know, the amplitude may change, the number of people who are adopting that coping strategy, or the actual amount that they decrease their consumption by. But you know, farmers in Africa do that every year, and so you know, I'm not really sure what the new thing is apart from urban coping strategies. I'm not really sure what the new or the subsequent long-term coping issue is at the moment. But that's not very helpful, is it?
Okay, we've got time for one more quick round. So 1, 2, 3. Duncan first. Let's go with Duncan first.
Sorry to come back for more. One question on, you talked about coping at the household level and you talked about the action of the state. Some of the interesting stuff from the IDS work was the importance of social networks, churches, community organisations, a whole range of non-state institutions at local level, which were in many cases were more important than either the state or NGOs, but you know, other people were playing. And the second thing is another way of framing this, you know, the best way to cope is to already have a load of things in place. Is if you've got an effective state, then fine, then you're already up and running and it's fine. It would be good out of this research is if you could say, what do you do if you've only got 5 civil servants on the case? What do you do if you've got 50? And what do you do if you've got 500? Because it seems that different things will make sense in those contexts, and that might be a different way of looking at it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ian Buse, Plan International. I have a couple of questions, really, following what's been said. The first is to Steve, and I'd like to know whether the great price rise in Bangladesh continued for the subsequent Aus and Oman harvests, and if not, what effect that had. Was it made into the sort of permanent, semi-permanent measure that he had? The second point is generally about on-farm and collective local storage, of which I'm very, very much a protagonist. But there is always the problem of pests. And it may cost an enormous amount for
for a family at its local level to try and ensure that the stuff isn't eaten by rats or indeed got at by bacteria and fungi. And I don't know that that's been mentioned so far.
Thank you. One more over here.
Steve was saying about the difference between the volatility and then just a general increase in price. I just wanted to comment on how much the causes behind the volatility are the underlying demand and supply, which would seem to explain more the general rise in prices, and what the impact of the problems of commodity cycles that we've always had are, but most recently what the problem of financial speculation has been on the price volatility.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, most of those questions seem to be coming your way, Steve.
You asked about the Bangladesh price support. I'm embarrassed to say I can't tell you the definitive answer on that. What I think I understood from Hussein's account is it has been kept in place, largely on the grounds that they had a long discussion in Cabinet on whether to raise the procurement price. But once they'd done it, they more or less said, look, we've got to live with this. This is absolutely vital. And there was presumably considerable vindication of the factions on the Cabinet who said raise the price when they looked at what they got in terms of a price response. You ask about volatility, financial speculation. Yeah. Why do we get volatility in markets? Well, we do have to remind ourselves that in the food price spike, the first explanation of the food price spike, of course, was failing markets. You know, this is the ultimate death of liberalisation. And that was before we realised that the food price spike was so much greater on the rice market than it was on the maize and the wheat markets. And we believe that most of the volatility on the rice price market comes from public action. Not so much from markets. It's markets being spooked by what governments have done. And we've had earlier questions in here about, you know, are we going to get another food price spike? Well, I would say for maize and wheat, you can probably sleep tight. Not a big fear. Rice is absolutely ready to go. Yeah, it's a powder keg. It's not a powder keg because the rice ain't being produced. It's a powder keg because you only need one or two governments, and let's name the government that is getting a very bad name for this. It's the government of the Philippines. And we got a tremendous account yesterday from David Dorr, who knows quite a lot about the Philippines, of how in early 2008 the Filipino government, looking at a pretty good local harvest, still started passing out messages, my goodness, we need to double the amount of imports into the Philippines. We'll pay any price that anybody offers us in the world, plus a premium. And by the way, all Filipino consumers, times are tough. Why don't you eat half as much rice as you've done before? Everybody rushes to the supermarket and doubles their buying. You know, I mean, yeah, so a lot of this price volatility, it's not quite what some of us first thought it was. You asked specifically, by the way, about financial speculation. Well, you'll probably know there's a tremendous ding-dong debate going on in this between one group of people who are adamant that financial speculation was very important versus another group who are equally adamant in the other direction. I think there are very strong reasons. Those of us who don't believe it was financial speculation, our ultimate argument, well, we're looking at rice, on which there was little or no financial speculation, saying how come the rice price spike was greater. But you can only get contagion from a futures market to a spot market, we believe, if people are physically holding stocks. And certainly in the US, all of that portfolio investment in long-term futures or long-term rolling investment in futures contracts, nobody was holding physical stocks. So we don't believe that it could have got to the spot market. But it's a big debate.
Jonathan.
Yes, volatility, I think looking at the coarse grain market, which is the main concern in Africa, in the sense that it's much more consumed by lower income people, and there isn't so much you can do about volatility with rice, because imported volatility happens very rarely. And holding stocks against something that's going to happen once every 30 years, because India decides to close its borders. It's something nobody's going to invest in. No government's going to invest in that. Though you can lower import duties and take measures like this, mitigating measures to mitigate against the hardship. But the volatility in the coarse grain markets. Remember logistics. In Africa, you don't have big rivers, river navigation like the Mississippi or the Paraná, where you can move large quantities of grain, low costs, down to the ports. I mean, the costs 10 years ago, moving from Chicago to New Orleans, $10 a ton. The costs of moving from the parts of the southern highlands of Tanzania to the coast, approaching 100. It's ridiculous. The comparison is enormous. So moving stuff around is expensive, and you need to move stuff around in order to balance off surpluses and deficits, because one year one country may be in surplus, its neighbours in deficit. That relationship sometimes can swap. So there's an inherent situation, inherent part of the logistics. But complicating this is the political aspirations that everybody would like stable prices, more stable than politicians than the system can deliver. And politicians trying to second-guess the market and force it into a straitjacket, which ends up creating further instability, because what they do is to force. They create situations like they say we are, for example, the case of Zambia. The government says there's going to be a shortage. We are going to import. And then the private sector could import, but will not import because it doesn't know what government's going to do. It thinks government's going to have subsidised sales, and they'll lose their shirt. And these things force the price up even when the crisis comes, the shortage comes at the end of the season, prices go even higher. So it's very difficult to overcome that because of the combination of the logistics, the underlying economics, and the expectation of people and politicians, which you can't quite marry up. On the question of pests, yes, I say, sir, that's important. Did actually mention the triple bagging of cowpeas. You see, in the Sahelian countries, there isn't much of a storage problem with millet and sorghum. Probably the pests, but you get a bit of webbing, but you don't really get a very serious problem. But cowpeas and wanzu, there's another pulse there, which are serious storage problems. And this technology looks as if it's offering the way to be overcoming that. Elsewhere, I mentioned the metal silos. That is also, it's a way that the attractiveness of that technology completely eliminates the farmer's concern. If you use it properly, you have the stuff shut up in a hermetic space with a couple of fustoxin tablets, or was it 4, I can't remember, and you fumigate it, and you're absolutely sure that the stuff will be there. In the lean season, it gets rid of the anxiety. And then, of course, there's a great deal of use of contact insecticides, but frequently misused. And there's differing versions from who depends who you talk to, whether that's due to adulteration of the chemicals, or probably what is more likely, it's due to farmers applying insufficient quantities of these storage chemicals.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. It's time for us to wrap up. I would like to thank the speakers for their stimulating presentations, all of you for coming and for your discussion, DFID for funding this work. I want to conclude with a couple of very brief observations. First of all, I think the framework was very helpful. Secondly, what I draw from this was drawn out to some extent by what Jonathon was saying just now, the importance of politics and the contradictions there. People have to be seen to do something, but that's what causes a lot of the problems in the relationship between the private sector and the public sector. Secondly, food prices. Are high prices a good thing or a bad thing? And I think we've heard both today. And a critical issue here is the question of food deficit producers. And I would question Steve's strong arguments about how good high prices are for eliciting a response to saying, yep, that's fine in some countries and for some farmers, but not in other countries and in other farmers. And that leads on to the question of diversity, and diversity between countries, diversity between situations, and diversity within countries between different types of farmers and consumers. And on that note, thank you very much indeed.